Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle are sending well wishes to the president and the first lady after they announced that they had tested positive for COVID-19. Republican Senator Martha McSally tweeted earlier this morning that she's praying for a swift recovery. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy tweeted, "Everyone should hope for a full recovery." The outpouring of bipartisan support comes amid questions about how the positive tests will impact Capitol Hill. So we bring in Nancy Cordes, who's following the very latest from Capitol Hill and is joining us now. So Nancy, we've sort of given an indication of what some lawmakers had to say, what they tweeted out earlier this morning. How are lawmakers reacting?
Well, it depends on how close they've been to this president and whether they themselves are now potentially at risk of having contracted coronavirus as well. Jim Jordan, for example, who was on Air Force One earlier this week, congressman from Ohio, says he is going to get a COVID test today. He's scheduled to attend a hearing this morning about the coronavirus. He says out of an abundance of caution, he is going to attend that hearing from his office. He won't be there in person. Marsha Blackburn, another senator who was at the debate and now has to decide whether she is going to get tested. All week, in fact, the president's new nominee for Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, has been here on the Hill. She's working out of the White House as she prepares for her confirmation hearings, but then she's coming up to Capitol Hill to meet with dozens of senators. She has had those one-on-one meetings. We've been in a bunch of them. Nobody is masked. They're sitting about 6 feet apart for about an hour at a time. And it isn't just her. The White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, was here on the Hill in those meetings. The vice president was here on the Hill in those meetings. So there's a lot of flow back and forth between the White House and Capitol Hill. And you have a lot of lawmakers this morning sort of assessing what their risk level is and deciding whether they, too, need to get tested and what they should do in the meantime.
You know, it strikes me, Nancy, that these members of Congress, the senators, this is surprising news, especially if they have been in contact with the president or members of his administration. I know you mentioned some of those folks who were in contact with the president's inner circle, but have we heard at all from them subsequent to the news breaking?
From lawmakers
like
who
Jim
have been
Jordan,
with,
for example, yeah.
Yes. So Jim Jordan has been on TV already this morning. He's talked to reporters, talked to CBS. He says he is going to get a test. At this point, he's asymptomatic, but out of an abundance of caution, he is going to stay in his office. He's not going to go to a hearing that is scheduled on the coronavirus in person. I think for a lot of people, though, it's going to be a waiting game, because just because they test negative now doesn't mean that they won't test positive a few days from now. I was, as I said, in the room for a lot of these meetings with Amy Coney Barrett, for example. No one was masked. She wasn't wearing a mask. The senators weren't wearing masks. Vice President Pence, wasn't wearing a mask. Mark Meadows, White House Chief of Staff, Pat Cipollone, the chief counsel at the White House. No one was masked. And so, this is kind of a situation that is still developing, and it raises big questions, for example, about what happens to the confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett that are scheduled to take place just a week and a half from now if some members of the Senate Judiciary Committee are quarantined. Do they put the hearing on hold, even though Republicans are very eager to confirm her before the election? Do they go ahead and have some individuals appear remotely? Does Amy Coney Barrett appear remotely if it turns out that she, too, needs to quarantine? These are all questions that are still up in the air right now.
Wow. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, Nancy, but yeah, Anne-Marie, that's a big one.
Completely. And when we think about we go through, if the president is unable to perform his duties and the vice president, and then we go down to Nancy Pelosi, and the vice president is in his 60s, but, we're talking about an awful lot of people that are in their 70s and even 80s.
Yes.
And I'm not even sure. So suddenly we're entertaining, what would happen if. And I'm not even sure how it is, if there's protocol to determine that any one of these people are unable to perform their duties. Is there a particular test, or, how do we even come to that conclusion? I don't know if you know that, Nancy.
My understanding is that it is determined by the White House itself, in conjunction, obviously, with the president's doctors. I don't know that we are quite at that scenario yet where plans are being put into place, because obviously the president is symptomatic. The vice president's office says he tested negative just this morning. And so, I don't know that anyone is knocking on Nancy Pelosi's door or Chuck Grassley's door and saying, hey, get ready. So that line of succession does exist. Everyone knows their roles. You're right. Nancy Pelosi herself is 80 years old. Chuck Grassley is, I believe, 87. So everyone in that graphic is, for the most part, in a higher risk category, and they've spent a lot of time with each other. Nancy Pelosi and Steven Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, just sat down together this week, and it shows you sort of the web of interactions between all of these people who are such key figures in our government. And I have to say that lawmakers and public officials, it turns out, are not the best at social distancing. I interviewed a number of Republican senators this week who were wearing masks but wore them under their nose.
I saw that in your interview this week, Nancy. I was going to say something, but yeah, I did notice that.
I mean, and these are they're people, or they wouldn't be in government in the first place. They wouldn't have run for elected office. They like to be around other people. They like to talk, and they like to be in close proximity with others. So it's sort of an elevated risk that we've been dealing with on Capitol Hill for months now.
Nancy, the other question, though, is, and we put up that graphic showing the line of continuity for this government, for our government. But with the number of people that we are unsure of right now who may have been exposed to the virus, I mean, we're talking about there are people within the West Wing who have specific jobs, and if they are laid low by this virus, then that means the wheels of government potentially could slow down. I'm wondering what you're hearing from lawmakers, specifically those that we just showed there, like Nancy Pelosi, like Chuck Grassley, about national security. Because as Major Garrett pointed out earlier this morning, and I think we're going to talk to Major at some point throughout the morning, our enemies and our allies are looking very, very closely at what is happening. And they will be looking very closely at who within the president's inner circle becomes infected. And there've got to be, I'm guessing that folks like Nancy Pelosi and Pompeo and Grassley are getting briefings now that they perhaps were not getting because of just the contingency plans in place.
Possibly. It's still a little early for that. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the president, as long as he's asymptomatic, he may have to be quarantined, but he can still do his job. He can still be in contact with all of his aides, except possibly for Hope Hicks, who is still recovering from coronavirus. So he can carry on, and I think all these officials can carry on as well. What we've heard this morning from David Martin, our Pentagon correspondent, is there is no change in the U.S. defensive posture. And I think even the president's political opponents, like Nancy Pelosi, would be reluctant to ever imply that somehow the U.S. was less safe because the leader of the free world had tested positive for coronavirus but was asymptomatic. I don't think that they would want to imply that somehow we were, in a weaker position vis-a-vis the rest of the world because of this diagnosis. I think they'll want to take a very cautious approach. And obviously, this is still unfolding. So what they might say today could be very different from what they say 2 days from now, 3 days from now, if the president develops symptoms. And then I think you really do get into uncharted waters. As you pointed out, Vlad and Anne-Marie, who decides whether the president is incapacitated or not? You could envision a scenario where the president says, I'm fine to carry on, I'm in charge, but you've got Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer saying, no, you're sick, you can't do this, you need to hand over the reins to Vice President Mike Pence. So this is just a situation that we haven't really experienced before, and it's hard to say right now exactly how it's going to play out. Well,
in that scenario, Nancy, the only law that will matter is the law of science and biology, because you can think and believe that you are whatever you think that you are. But as we know, this virus doesn't have sides. This virus knows no boundaries. And I guess that will ultimately determine, we saw, I mean, if there's a model, it's probably the UK when we saw a head of state there infected with COVID-19.
Right. So it just depends
Yeah,
on
that's
who's
very true,
calling the
but-
shots. It depends on, whether
yes.
it's the president's doctor at the end of the day who makes the call and says you need to head over the reins, or more likely whether it's the president and those around him who get to make that decision.
Interesting.
Yeah, and just to remind everyone, and we said this at the top of the hour, the reason we even know about this is because of some really good reporting, and not because the White House was particularly transparent. So you have to wonder if we can depend on the White House to sort of give us that kind of information. But as you point out, Nancy, we are far from that. We don't even know if the First Lady and the President are even showing any symptoms. And you also point out that business will continue. And so I just want to sort of bring up something COVID-related that is important to the rest of the country, which is this COVID relief package. We know that Nancy Pelosi was meeting with Secretary Mnuchin to hammer out some sort of package to help people who have run out of money. Do we know whether or not they will be meeting again, what the plan is in the near future to find some common ground?
We haven't been told that they have another in-person meeting scheduled, and I suspect that any in-person meetings that might have been taking place today might end up going on the phone instead, just out of an abundance of caution. They're still talking, but obviously the House has pushed ahead with its own vote on a $2.2 trillion package because the two sides just weren't, imminently going to reach a deal, and the House is leaving for the month of October. So they took that vote. It narrowly passed. There were some Democratic defectors. All the Republicans voted no. And now the House is leaving town. So those talks continue between Secretary Mnuchin and Speaker Pelosi. And it's possible that this new development could impact the urgency of getting a deal in some ways, because after all, if there is no deal, then there's no chance that this coronavirus relief package, which includes things like another $600 a week for people who are unemployed and another round of stimulus checks and money for schools. None of that is going to happen if the Senate doesn't bring it up. And the Senate is not going to bring it up if there is no deal between the White House and Nancy Pelosi. So this is dead on arrival unless there is some kind of negotiated agreement. And, while they haven't had any success in the past, yes, perhaps this latest situation at the White House could increase the urgency for it. Perhaps if the president isn't able to get out and campaign for the next couple of weeks, he might urge Treasury Secretary Mnuchin to raise his offer in the hopes of showing the American people he's there for them in another way. But as of right now, they're still at least $500 billion apart.
All right, to be continued. Nancy Cordes, as always, Nancy, thank you so very much. We really appreciate it. I know it's a busy, hectic news day.
Sure
Thank
thing.
you.
You're welcome.